It's the video you've all been waiting for. It's the Shimmering Skies meta report. What are the best decks in set 5? I've put so many hours into the first week of Disney Lorcana. I would say I'm probably the best placed person to tell you what decks are good and which ones I don't have quite so much hope for. But bear in mind, I'm just one person. While I've got 20 decks on this list, I've probably only played about 12 of them, which is still quite a lot. And of course, I've played against most of them as well. I do have every single ink color combination represented, even Amber Sapphire, which was the main deck I really struggled with. But I think that we've got an incredibly diverse meta. I think Ursula's return, we kind of got used to a more narrow meta, while there was quite a few decks which crept into it towards the end. The Diablo Bucky deck really was keeping a lot of decks out of the meta and really just kind of made it quite narrow. Whereas now, the Bucky deck has been, well, Bucky got errated, so the Bucky deck is no longer a thing, and we've got all these new cards. We're back to this just wildly balanced meta in Disney Lorcana, and it's a huge credit to the game devs. I want to give a thank you to today's sponsor, Card Market, the best place to buy your Disney Lorcana singles. Check them out in the description below. So Hyper Aggro obviously is the talk of the town with the addition of Daisy Duck. And the reason you pair Amber with Amethyst is because Amethyst has access to Befuddle. Befuddle is this 1-cost card which can return a character or item with cost 2 or less to their player's hand. You play the Daisy Duck on turn 1, and then on turn 2, you're going to play ideally another Daisy Duck, maybe a Maleficent, a Lilo, and then you befuddle back the character on your opponent's side of the board. This is going to mean it's very, very difficult for your opponent to stop Daisy questing at least twice. And then you can start using the bounce package with Madam Mim Snake, Madam Mim Fox to replay your exerted characters which are questing for 2, play them readied, and that can just mean a really, really difficult time for your opponent. You've got lots of ways of guaranteeing lore with this deck, with cards like Baloo, which when this character is banished, gain 2 lore. There's 2 spell books in there. Donald Duck is also getting 1 lore when it enters play, as well as the new card Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, which is just gaining 2 lore. My list is definitely not the only way you can build it. In fact, it's quite controversial because you'll note that there's no copies of Goat, which sounds absolutely outrageous, and it's quite possible it's not correct. The reason I ended up not playing any Goats is because my most expensive character or most expensive card at all costs 3. Because in a lot of situations, you can just stay at 3 ink, keep that extra card in hand, and that's just going to be the difference often between being able to win or lose. Often you will go to 4. There's just a lot of games I stay at 3 ink, and then I don't actually want to be running the risk of top decking something like a Go. Of course, a card in the Inkwell is 1 card less in hand. So Hyper Aggro is going to look like this. You could, of course, cut, I think, the Gale and the Pinocchio as well as the Wendy to fit in some 4-cost characters like Goat, Bruni, Dolores. A lot of people are always going to be a lot of people will also be looking at playing the library, which is got some really good synergy with Chernobogs and Magic Broom. In my opinion, though, a Hyper Aggro deck is going to be going to top decks a lot, and you just want to be playing a threat which is guaranteed at least 1 lore if your opponent doesn't remove it instantly. And of course, the library can gain 1 lore if it's not removed instantly. But a lot of the time with a Hyper Aggro deck, you've completely lost the board. If you top deck that library, it's going to gain you no lore at all often. And that is why I don't think you should play locations in Hyper Aggro. This is my take on the deck. There's many different ways you can build it. I also want to mention that you can definitely play these Hyper Aggro decks with many different ink colors. I think Emerald, Steel, Amethyst, and Amber can all be combined in different ways for very, very aggressive decks this set. So for me, Hyper Aggro is really, really strong. And I think I'm going to go ahead and put it in the S tier, which is probably going to surprise a lot of people. I think I'm kind of tempted between A and S, and we might change as we go along. But for me, while I think this deck is likely to kind of end up slightly further down here, I think that even if you've got loads of text for this deck, it's very, very difficult to beat when this deck goes first. You can put so many texts in your deck and the Hyper Aggro decks can still run away with it. We'll put it in the A tier for now because there's probably the meta's warping enough around this Daisy Duck that it's not going to be S tier, but it is very, very strong. If your deck is not teched to beat Hyper Aggro, you will lose. It's that good. Up next, we have Ruby Amber Mufasa, or as I like to call it, Bufasa. So many different ways you can go about building this deck. A big reason I kind of included one of Wreck-It Ralph and Scar and Be Prepared was because I kind of wanted to give mentions to these kinds of cards. Many different ways you can build it. The core is Gaston on turn 3. That's going to allow you to play Mother Gothel and Rapunzel on turn 4. Rapunzel, that big card draw tool in this deck. Of course, you've got Mufasa to be careful of board clears. If you're expecting a board clear, Mufasa can help you high roll something really big. A lot of people like to play Maleficent Dragons in this deck because of the high roll potential of Mufasa. I personally would not go near the dragons. I think that it's a bit of a pipe dream. You don't really want to get to 9 lore too often. But this deck's got a lot of interesting things going on. I think Daisy Duck is a really nice addition for the deck. It's a deck which has struggled for a consistent curve quite often. So my build is quite aggressive with Daisy Duck on 1. Also Pluto as an option on 1, just 2 copies of it. It's a really nice card to play on turn 1. Allows you to play Gaston on 2, but can be a really awkward top deck later on. The Milan's also great because, of course, you can heal it with Rapunzel, and then you've got the ability to shift in Milan Elite Archer. 4 copies of that might be a bit heavy, but it's definitely one of the best tools to deal with the hyper aggro decks in the game. Milan, I tried it in a Ruby Emerald deck. It was too slow. Turn 5 shift Milan is too slow, but when you've got Gaston, you could, of course, play Doc in this deck as well. You can get that shift in much, much sooner. This deck also has access to Scar, which with Gaston you can get down quite quickly to clear those hyper aggro threats away. 1 copy of Be Prepared could be an idea. We did see a couple copies of Be Prepared in a list at Disney Lorcana Challenge. The Sisu as well as a shift 6 could be good with the Emboldened Warrior. I went for Flynn Rider as a nice bit of curve on 2 because this Perdita in the late game, it can resurrect a Milan to set up a shift Milan later in the game. It can resurrect Daisy Duck, Flynn Rider, or Mother Gothel for card draw. So the Perdita's very, very useful in this one. Wreck-It Ralph is an interesting new addition. I think Sven is a card a lot of people have been underestimating so far. When you play this character, you may ready chosen character. They can't quest or challenge for the rest of this turn. Well, they might not be able to quest, but they can exert to use their ability. So you can use Gaston on 3, pay 2 for Sven, ready the Gaston, and then pay 2 more for Sven. And then you could still ready your Gaston again, exert your Gaston again, and pay a 2-cost card. So Sven Gaston's got some really interesting synergies. It's also just quite a nice tool to protect your questers. I think Sven is also a consideration for these aggro decks if you do go to 4 ink. I think I would play Goat and Sven possibly at 4 cost in that hyper aggro deck we just looked at. Surface Itch for the card draw. 1 copy of Invited to the Ball could be interesting, which is reveal the top 2 cards of your deck. Put revealed character cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom. Of course, Brawl is also an option. It does make your Mufasa worse. Lots of different ways to build Ruby Amber. I did experiment a little bit with a Robin Hood action focus deck. The big problem with a deck like that is many of the actions you want to play are uninkable, and the deck becomes very clunky very quickly. Overall, I think Ruby Amber could be a great deck this set. I think being able to ramp into the Shift Milan gives you one of the best ways of dealing with hyper aggro in the game. And with a card like Daisy Duck available, you could get some real quick lore in as well. So it's got that balance of being able to control the aggro deck while hopefully being quick enough to beat the slower decks. I think I'm going to go ahead and put Mufasa into the B tier. Probably my list would be like a C or D tier, but I think once the right list is found, it could be a solid option and actually prove to be even better than I'm giving it credit for. Next, we have Ruby Sapphire Control. This is very much inspired by Ely, who won the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Bologna with a similar looking list. Of course, you could play a more traditional version of the deck without the items and the queen. But I have to say, I like the look of an item build coming into this set because it probably gives you a decent matchup into hyper aggro, which for a more traditional list with 1 jumper heads and fishbone quills is going to be doomed. But this deck utilizes ice blocks with Sisu Daring Visitor, which is this 3 cost evasive, which when you play this character, you banish chosen character with 1 strength or less. One of the best answers to Daisy Duck in the game. Of course, then, for just 6, you could shift in the Sisu Emboldened Empowered Sibling to clear the board, and that's going to allow you to stabilize pretty well against those aggro decks. So definitely an interesting take on the build. You can play the Queen and just combo lots of items. Maurice's Workshop is going to be your main way of drawing cards. There is the new Ruby Chromicon, which can give your Maui some extra strength to remove locations. But I decided to include the new Cuzco card in here, which is probably one of the most replaceable cards, which is an interesting way to deal with items or locations. In a mirror, for example, the Kuzco can remove the Lucky Dime, and against a Ruby Amethyst deck, the Kuzco is going to be great to deal with those locations. Lots of items, lots of late game control. Of course, the Lucky Dime Tamatoa can quite literally gain 20 lore in a single turn with this deck. I think it's a pretty solid deck. Again, definitely still worth experimenting with the traditional way of building it. I just wanted to give you a deck which would be able to deal quite well with the hyper aggro onslaughts that you're going to be finding at your locals. For me, if your deck loses to Daisy Duck, you probably want to play a different deck, because I think Daisy Duck will be everywhere. Overall, Ruby Sapphire, I think is going to be a really good deck this set. I'm going to go and put it into the A tier. I think the Ice Block Sisus give it enough coverage against hyper aggro, and the deck has lots of ways of being built differently. It's a very high skill ceiling deck, and it's one I think will continue to do well. So this is probably the most interesting new deck from the set, and it is Emerald Sapphire. This is really, really strong. I've already posted some streams playing this deck, and I also played at a tournament recently where I finished 4th out of around 28 people or so. It's a really, really strong deck when it works. And what it focuses on is it focuses on playing Clarabelle down, where you have an empty hand. Now, Clarabelle, at the end of your turn, if chosen opponent has more cards in their hand than you, you may draw cards until you have the same number. So you utilize Fishbone Quill and the new card Tipo, which is when you play this character, you may put a card from your hand into your Inkwell face down and exerted. That also includes Uninkables. It also utilizes Belle's ability. Read a book. During your turn, you may put an additional card from your hand into your Inkwell face down. And then you empty your hand. Clarabelle's the last card, ideally, in your hand. You end your turn. If your opponent's got 5 cards in their hand still, you draw 5 cards, which is absolutely obscene. There's also the potential to shift Clarabelle in this deck onto the Clarabelle Clumsy Guest, who is also a pretty good card in the late game to remove items. It's a really great deck when your opponent has no idea how to play against it. It feels absolutely busted. It feels like the best deck in the world. However, in my experience, it does have quite a few tricky matchups. There's quite a few different ways you can go about beating this deck. Well, firstly, it suffers potentially from consistency issues. If you miss Flaversham in the early game or you miss the Clarabelle, you're pretty much doomed. That's why I've added in some copies of Vision of the Future, which previously was Ursa the Deceiver. Vision for the Future allowing you to really dig into your deck and find what you need when you need it. The big counters to this is Discard. Discard can give this all kinds of problems because you're relying on emptying your hand very aggressively and getting Clarabelle down. If Clarabelle's the last card in your hand that you're ready to play on the next turn and it gets discarded, you're probably losing the game unless you top deck the Clarabelle at the perfect moment. Similarly, something like You Have Forgotten Me can really disrupt this, but even something simple like an Ursa the Deceiver on turn 2, when you're going second, can discard your 1 jump ahead and really, really slow you down. So discard is a big counter to this deck, but there's more than just discard which can counter this. Another big strategy is to dump your own hand. So for example, I played against Sapphire Steel the other day. My opponent, Adzi, they used their Fishbone Quill to keep their own hand size low. I played my Clarabelle down. It maybe drew me a card. And the next turn, they had a Let It Go in hand, ready to get rid of my Clarabelle. Suddenly, they had a Flaversham on the board, ready to quest. They had all sorts. I had nothing. The other thing that can happen is the deck is inconsistent potentially. So the deck can absolutely pop off using cards like You're Welcome, Mother Knows Best. You could also play the Mother Gothel cards to bounce cards back into your opponent's hand, which represents card draw for Clarabelle. It's also what the Muses and the Mother Knows Best does. But it is also pretty inconsistent and pretty counterable. Having said all that, I still think the deck is absolutely tremendous, and it is the best deck to absolutely crush your local gaming store over the next week or two, because they are not going to know what has hit them. Moving forwards, while I think this is like, for the first week of the first set, I think this is like the best deck right now, I really don't think that's going to stay the case once people learn how to play against it. I'm going to go ahead and put the Blue Cow into the A tier. I do think it's a very good deck. Do you know what? I'm going to move Mufasa. I'm going to put the Blue Cow into B. I'm going to put the Blue Cow into B. I think it could prove to be really, really good because the Clarabelle pops off in a huge way. It really, really does. And there's so many decks which just can't deal with it. But my intuition tells me it's too disruptable. I think it really struggles against locations, which Ruby Amethyst is going to be playing a lot of. Most Amethyst decks, in fact, will be playing lots of locations. It really struggles against discard, which I think is going to be popular. And also the Fishbone Quill can give it a hard time as well. So it could be amazing. I think right now for like week 1, it's here. But I think it's going to settle around here. Maybe A tier. Mill is one of my favorite decks in Disney Lorcana, and it got so much support this set. It's still more of a meme deck because you can build the deck in a more competitive way by probably just removing the Lady Tremaines, the Do It Agains, and the Hypnotic Deductions. But it's a really, really fun deck if you want to play at locals, catch your opponents off guard. I wouldn't recommend it for a Disney Lorcana challenge. The aim of the deck is to win in a couple of different ways. The first way to win is just by controlling the board and questing to 20. However, the deck's main win condition is quite unorthodox, which is that it doesn't need to quest at all. You use a whole new world multiple times by playing Do It Again, Lady Tremaine, Wicked Stepmother, and then you just make your opponent draw so many cards that then the final whole new world you play, you still have some cards left in your deck, your opponent has 0. If you try to draw a card when you have 0 cards left in your deck in Lorcana, you lose the game. Your Welcome is a great addition to this deck as well, because you can shuffle cards like locations or characters or items back into your opponent's deck and they draw 2. So you're adding 1 card back to their deck, but they draw 2, which is milling them 1 extra card. What that means is, in theory, you could play a mill deck of around 63 cards and still get away with it. This one currently is at 67, utilizing the new Mother Gothels. The 2-drop is a okay card on turn 2 if you're looking to shift Mother Gothel to sing a whole new world early on. But moreover, it's great in the late game to bounce cards back to your opponent's hand. Clarabelle is a interesting addition to this one because it's really the backup card, which if your mill game plan isn't quite working, you can then fall back on Clarabelle. A big problem a deck like this has had in the past is if you miss this first whole new world, you're doomed. Because you can't use Do It Again, you can't use Lady Tremaine on a whole new world if you never found the first. So while Mill still has that inconsistency of needing to find the first whole new world, now, at least if things go pear-shaped and you don't find a whole new world, you're able to shift in to Clarabelle on turn 5 with either Morph or the 3-drop Clarabelle, and then you can start drawing cards that way, and you just go for a more traditional Emerald Steel game plan of controlling the board and questing. Hypnotic Deduction is also a tremendous addition to this one because you're able to draw 3 cards and put 2 from your hand on the top of your deck. Another problem that mill decks can have in the past is if you have, for example, 2 A Whole New Worlds in your hand, you play the first whole new world, the second one gets discarded, and then you draw into 7 new cards and you don't have access to another whole new world, and it just slows down your game plan. However, now you could use Hypnotic Deduction to keep 1 whole new world in your hand, put 1 on the top, so then you sing a whole new world, you get another whole new world in your hand, and if you've got another singer, bang, you can just really cycle those whole new worlds very quickly together, which is the objective of this deck. Mickey Mouse Food Fight Defender is a tremendous shift target. With Resist, it's almost impossible for your opponent to remove, and you can shift in the Playful Sorcerer. And another thing that is great about this deck compared to the past is there's so many less uninkables which you have to play. Previously, you've got Do It Again, Grab Your Sword, Tremaine, Whole New World, but then you would also have like the Shift Captain Hook as a card you would have to play. Well, that's no longer a case. You've got great shift options, and this backup card draw tool for Clarabelle is just what the deck needs to feel a little bit less of a meme and actually have some alternative game plans if you don't find that first whole new world. So having said all that, I bet you think that Mill is going to go right up into the A tier. No, it's in the D tier. Come on, it's still Mill. But there is another version of Emerald Steel in this. In fact, there's 2 other Emerald Steel decks in this tier list, and one of them is also utilizing a whole new world, but it just drops the mill cards. We'll look at that in just a moment. So what do you get for cutting the mill package of Lady Tremaine, Do It Again, Hypnotic Deduction? Well, that's 12 cards you can get rid of. And then, of course, your deck is about 67 cards in mill. So yeah, you're getting about 5 new slots. Well, this list might be a bit too top-heavy. You can see there's only 1 copy of Mr. Smee in there. Maybe you want to remove the Tinkerbells, the Kronk, for example. Lots of different ways you can go about building this deck, but I think it's got so much potential. In a similar vein, you've still got the Whole New World stuff. If you shift in early when you're going first, you can morph, play your Robin Hood, shift into a whole new world. Jobs are good. But you've also got alternative strategies. If you don't want to play the whole new world, you can just utilize Clarabelle to really pop off in a big way. It's possible you don't even want 4 copies of a whole new world. You could also play Strike a Good Match as a way of discarding a whole new world. It's also a good song for Ursula in some situations. I did want to include 1 copy of Kronk, Head of Security, into the mixer here as well, as a really interesting greedy tool. If ever there was a deck for it, it's going to be this one with the Morphs in the deck. I think Morph looks tremendous. You've also got great coverage against aggro with the Tinkerbell shift on 4 onto Morph just being great. You get to play Ursula Deceiver. I think there's a lot of potential in this one. It's quite possible that the list I've built is a little bit too top heavy. Maybe you remove the Kronk, maybe the Tinkerbells go. It's possible you keep the Tinkerbells but remove the Grab Your Swords. So many different options for this deck. Of course, the Ursula Deceiver of all is not necessary, but I think it's got a lot of potential. I really like the look of this deck. There's loads of different ways you could build it as well, with things like Robin Hood, Robin's Bow. You could try some kind of like Beast Relentless Bio, 1-turn knockout. Definitely keep an eye on an Emerald Steel deck like this with a whole new world. There's one more Emerald Steel deck that we still are going to look at in today's video though. I've actually got a really good feeling about Emerald Steel this set. I'm going to put it down into the C tier for now. And I want you to bear in mind at this point in time, I think the meta is wide open. So I think even decks in C tier are very much good enough to play competitively. And there's not much between these. Really, the listings here are very, very subjective at this stage. And you should take them with a massive pinch of salt. But I do have a lot of interest in Emerald Steel this set. And do you know what? I'm going to put it up to the B tier. And I think it could prove me wrong and be even better than that. The final Emerald Steel deck, and one I haven't yet played, is very similar to a set 3 Emerald Steel deck before Bucky. There's a new addition in the form of Anna, Diplomatic Queen. This is the deck I feel like the card probably has a decent home in. Of course, you've got Prince John with that Ursula Deceiver of all being able to sing Sudden Chill, Storm Rage On, and Strength. Beast Tragic Hero makes a return into the mix. I think Beast is pretty good, as Ruby Amethyst is probably not going to be able to play too many copies of Madame Medusa, as the meta is quite quick. Friar Tuck, you guys know this deck. Not personally the way I would play Prince John Emerald this set. Definitely one worth checking out though, and could prove to be a very solid deck indeed. At that stage where I'm trying to reorganize the list a bit, I'm thinking I want to put Steel Tempo in the C tier, but I think I'm going to move these up a bit. I'm going to go like this. Going to rejiggle a bit. I'm going to put them into the S tier. I really don't think that there's like a single deck which belongs in the S tier, because I think the meta is so open. I think all of these are really, really good options. This feels like it's a little bit of a better balance to me. We have to make it up a bit as we go along in terms of the positions. Haven't changed the order of any of them. I was tempted to put Hyper Aggro in the S tier to begin with, and I don't think we're really in that meta where there's like, oh my goodness, this deck's so much better than everything else. And I think we're going to have a lot of decks in the S tier. The next deck is a personal favourite of mine. I've got myself the Bruno and the Robin Hood Sharpshooter Enchanted because I love this deck so much. It is my favourite deck I've played so far this set, without doubt. But does that mean it's the best? No. This is a Emerald Ruby deck, which, what does Emerald do? Well, it discards and it quests quite quickly. And what does Ruby do? Well, it controls the board. And that's what we've got. With only 16 different Ruby cards, we've got Robin Hood Sharpshooter as the focus of the deck, which is whenever this character quests, look at the top 4 cards of your deck. You may reveal an action card with cost 6 or less and play it for free. Discard the rest. 24 actions in here, which gives us around a 91% hit rate off Robin Hood. But what's really important is a lot of the time you want multiple options. For example, there's going to be some times where your opponent has no cards in hand. You're not going to want to hypnotize. Similarly, your opponent might have no 2 strength or less characters on the board. You're not going to want to brawl. So it's not only important to have consistent hits on Robin Hood, but it's also nice to have multiple options. A Pirate Scythe with Robin Hood is secretly a bit of a star of the show because you're stealing 2 lore from your opponent, which is great against aggro decks, while gaining 2 yourself, meaning Robin Hood is questing for 4 and your opponent loses 2 lore. That is insane because it's still a threat down on the board. The other thing which is great about Robin Hood in this deck is its synergy with Prince John. You can play the Prince John either on turn 5 before you quest with Robin Hood, or of course on turn 3 before. And then if your Robin Hood hits We Don't Talk About Bruno, not only is your opponent bouncing a card back to their hand and discarding, but then it also is card draw for you. Added to that, if you hit Hypnotize off Robin Hood and you've got a Prince John down, your opponent discards and you're going to draw twice, which turns Robin Hood into an incredible engine. The other options are Hypnotic Deduction off Robin Hood, where you can draw 3 and then put 2 back, essentially just adding 1 card to your hand. Of course, you can also use Hypnotic Deduction to set up a Robin Hood, whereas if you're in the late game and you want Robin Hood to hit a Pirate's Life, for example, or you really want it to hit a Hypnotize or a Bruno, you could use Hypnotic Deduction first, put that action back on top of your deck, and then also draw into maybe some of those more powerful cards, get rid of like a Merfolk that you don't want, and then just discard that off the Robin Hood. Your Welcome's not spectacular in this deck, but it is just a nice option. Often I find myself questing first with, for example, the Ursula Deceiver, then questing with Robin Hood in case I hit that You're Welcome and I actually just want to use it to draw 2 cards for myself and get rid of that Ursula back into the deck. I just love this deck. The Clarabelle doesn't pop off in a huge way, but the 3-drop Clarabelle is just a solid option in this deck as a little bit of card draw. And if you miss Prince John, you're going to be very, very happy that you've got this Shift 5 Clarabelle as an option. Even if she's only drawing you 2 cards, that seems bad compared to the blue Sapphire Cow deck, but like only drawing 2 cards. That's a lot of cards. And she trades for a Maui. You know, she can often draw you 3 or 4 cards, quest for 2, and Maui removes her and is removed itself. Incredible. So the Merfolk, Pegasus, and Flynn give you enough aggression to beat the slower decks. And you should also just be able to beat the quicker decks, particularly when you go first. I think you're going to struggle against Hyper Aggro when you go second. But I tried teching for that matchup with cards like Lyle, with cards like Mulan, and it just made the deck worse everywhere else. The main card to consider playing is Diablo. There is a deck doing the rounds, which DeCandio played with Diablo. It's too slow, in my opinion, and I'm pretty convinced that this is the 60. If you wanted to change anything, you could consider removing maybe a couple copies of Hypnotic Deduction for some earlier curve, but nah, this is the deck. I absolutely love it. It's what I'm going to be playing whenever I get the opportunity to do so. So, what do I think about green actions? Is it the best deck in the game like I'm making it out to be? Well, I'm going to be conservative. I'm going to put it in the A tier. I think it could be right up there in the S tier. Again, I think that we've got a pretty wide open meta, but I'm going to try and not let my biases talk me into, I would personally put it in the S tier. Maybe that's what's holding it back, because I know that I'm biased for this deck and how much I enjoy it. But maybe it's not that good. I think it does struggle into a few of the other decks. I think Amber Steel Songs, Emerald Steel, and also the Sing Together Lemon and Lime deck are pretty tough matchups. I'm going to put it into the A tier, but I think I could see a world. Kind of tempted to put it up there. I'm going to put it into A tier. Because I actually think I've found the optimized list of this deck, whereas a lot of the other decks are not optimized. It is the deck I've played the most. I want to put it into the S tier. I'm going to leave it in A for now. Up next is Ruby Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst is an ever-present deck, and a disclaimer, I haven't actually played this list yet in set number 5, but it's a very popular deck. I've played against it a lot, and I think the main thing it's going to be looking to do is utilize the library and the Queen's Castle to give you some really good matchups against these heavier control decks, and hopefully you're able to deal with the hyper aggro decks. I'm not so sure that you're really going to be able to consistently deal with hyper aggro. You do have Fox on 3. You could look at maybe playing Rafiki on turn 4, which is another new rush character. Maui also on 5. If you can obviously get to 6 with Sisu and Be Prepared, you might get there, but you're probably going to struggle against hyper aggro. But you can give some of the more control heavy decks a real run for their money with things like the library and the Queen's Castle. Every single set, I say that the time for Ruby Amethyst is over, and I'm usually wrong. I am going to go ahead and say the time for Ruby Amethyst is not over, but I don't think it's one of the better decks this set. But I said that last set, and I was wrong. Overall, there's loads of different ways you can, of course, build Ruby Amethyst. It really does depend on what the meta shakes up and looks like. It depends, can you build this deck to beat Hyper Aggro? I would imagine you probably can't beat it consistently. But it's still an exciting deck, and I think it's one which will be played a lot and will be pretty good this set. Ruby Amethyst players, I'm tempted to put you in the B tier, but you're probably going to creep into the bottom of the A tier for now. But you've got a lot to prove to me. When I try the deck out myself, if I don't like it, I'll drop it down. But I think we've got to give Ruby Amethyst the benefit of the doubt. It's just been a consistently good deck. It got the library, which is an incredible, incredible card for the deck. And I think it's the deck that can utilize that location the most. Heroes up next. This is Ruby and Steel. I did try a Robin Hood Sharpshooter build, which I was quite optimistic about the potential of, but unfortunately I had no joy with it. Robin Hood Sharpshooter is quite interesting because it can, of course, play a whole new world. But the problem I found with the deck was that the Robin Hood Sharpshooter was only hitting removal options, and so many of them were uninkable. I just found the deck to be really clunky. Definitely interested in re-exploring Robin Hood Sharpshooter, but this one I went for. I relied on card draw in the form of Medallion Weight and Queen of Hearts, as well as the whole new world. Beast Tragic Hero could also give you some juice. I do think this color combination is underrated overall, but I still think it's one of the worst color combinations in Disney Lorcana, and I would not recommend playing this deck. It's possible that there is some kind of really sweet deck out there with this color combination. I think Ariel from set 3 that can give evasive whenever you play a song is of interest. And I do still want to try a little bit more the whole Robin Hood Whole New World idea, because it is pretty interesting. But I just found it to be a much worse version of Steel Songs, which is why I'm showing this hero focus list instead. I'm going to go ahead and put heroes at the D tier. Honestly, we need another tier for below mill. Don't play this deck, I don't think. Sapphire Steel has been a mainstay in the Disney Lorcana competitive space, and I don't think it's any different this set. While the deck didn't get that much new things, it's just a good deck, and I think it's going to continue to be pretty good. The two main new cards of interest is going to be this Kuzco Selfish Emperor or Simba Son of Mufasa. Very similar cards. Simba is when you play this character, you may banish chosen item or location, quest for 1, whereas Kuzco is putting it into the player's ink world, but quest for 2, and you can also use 4 ink to give your other characters resist 1. Probably the Simba's better. I just wanted to mention both. I do prefer the look of the Simba though, in truth. I also think that King Candy could find its way into this deck, which is a card a lot of people have been writing off. But if ever there was a deck for King Candy, it's probably this one. T-Po also going to be a nice option on turn 2, alongside maybe 1 jump ahead if you want to go down that route. I still think this deck's going to be very, very good, but I don't think it got that many new toys, and it's probably therefore going to fall off just a little bit. All right, guys, we're at that point where I'm going to give everything a bit of a rejig. I'm wanting to move Mufasa down, and I'm going to put Ruby Amethyst and Sapphire Steel down here. Controversial. They might be better than these two newer decks above them. The newer decks are maybe catching my eye because they're newer toys. Emerald Ruby and Emerald Sapphire in A tier. Who would have thought I've seen that? It's very possible that I'm just being biased because these are shiny new toys, whereas these are just the old consistent. But I just don't think these two decks got enough new things. The library is definitely very new, to be fair. I don't know, mate. Maybe we need to do this. It's a real tricky one. I think we'll do this. Songs, another deck I didn't get round to playing yet. I've been trying to avoid these decks, which are very similar to previous sets. But the main new tool this deck got is Prince Naveen, which is a tremendous card. I think 2 or 3, probably 3, might be the way you end up settling. But you've got a lot of uninkable songs. You know, you've got the Zeus, the Storm Rage on the Grab Your Swords, the Whole New World. That's a lot of uninkables, and I think the Daisy Ducks are also non-negotiable. So you could go to that third Prince Naveen, but you're going to need to be really careful on the ink count. And in a similar fashion, you don't want to reduce the song count too low. You want your Ariel to be hitting very, very consistently. For me, a lot of these Steel Song decks underplay the songs, and the Ariel misses too consistently for my taste. Smee Rapunzel still make the cut. Cinderella, I think, is back on the menu. You could definitely look at playing the shift option. Of course, there's Piglet, Pooh, Pirate Captain as well. I've got an awful lot of 1-drops here with the Cindy, the Queen, and the Daisy and Robin Hood. I think a lot of people are not going to want to play that many of them. But I think the Cinderella is an absolute auto include in this deck. She did start getting cut from a lot of the lists in set 4, but that's just because of the popularity of cards like Baboom. But those are just not going to be in the meta anywhere near as much now that Diablo is not so much of a threat. And therefore, I think Cinderella is not only really good going first, but also very good going second. I think Cinderella with all these 1-drops is meaning that your Strength of a Raging Fire can deal 3 damage on turn 2, which sounds absolutely fantastic. I think Steel Songs is great with the Queen shift as well, being able to deal with hyper aggro. It's good into most things. It is going to struggle potentially against these slower control decks. I think Ruby Sapphire is probably historically its toughest matchup. There's also AWNW as a new card for some lore gain. These song lists have always been very, very tight. Of course, as soon as you put Ariel in the deck, you've got 20 songs which you just have to play, and you've got your shift targets. You want to play Rapunzel, and before you know it, there's really not many spots left at all. But there's definitely a few things you could change, but the lists are going to be, the same 45 cards or so pretty much every single time. And I think not playing Daisy Duck with a whole new world, really, I just think that sounds absolutely outrageous. But there is, of course, the Golden Harp, which can do a very similar job to Daisy Duck in a song deck and is inkable. So that's the main thing to consider instead of the Daisy Duck. I even thought about playing both of them, but maybe not. For me, Songs is the front runner for best deck in the format, or at least one of them. I'm going to go ahead and put it into the S deck. I'm actually going to move the control deck down. I don't know if I like it that much. I'm keeping Hyper Aggro up there. I'm moving control down into the A tier. And I'm feeling pretty good about how this looks so far. You just got to feel these things out. Work your way into it, I've built all the decks and now I'm just looking at them all ordered. And this looks right to me. This looks right. I could still see these dropping down, but I'm going to keep them there. Steel Jafar is next. So Jafar just did not find its way into the set for metagame. I think the Amethyst Steel mid-range deck was very, very good. And I also didn't really play any Jafar. But I have to say, I'm pretty interested in Jafar this set. I haven't got Pete in the deck, but Pete could be an interesting addition because it protects your Jafar. If you manage to stick a Jafar, sing a whole new world, and then play Pete, it could mean that your Jafar is just going to be sticking around for another turn. I think the Amethyst Chromacon is in particular a fascinating card for this deck. You can exert it once per turn with your Jafar down, that's lore. But something this deck struggled for is you would be inking every turn, you'd be shifting, you just run out of cards in hand. So I think that this deck has a lot of room for experimentation. It's actually something, while I'm at Gamescom this week, I'm going to be experimenting quite a bit with Jafar because I think it's a really, really interesting card. And I think that it's got the possibilities to beat the aggro decks as well, maybe. If you play Grab Your Swords, if you play Grab Your Swords and you can shift Jafar in early, you can clear the early board, you can gain 20 lore very, very quickly. And the other reason I think you can beat the aggro decks is because I put this Tinkerbell Tiny Tactician into the mixer, shift Tink on 4, remove a bunch of cards all at once with your Tinkerbell, and you might just be able to beat those pesky hyper aggro players. I think Jafar's got a lot of potential this set. I don't know about the Simba. I put Simba in there because it's a Floodborn with the Blue Fairy. The Beast card draw, the Jafar Dreadnought card draw seems pretty decent with the Blue Fairy. I put the Library in there with the Chernobogs and the Brooms because Chernobogs and Brooms with Jafar is just pure value. The Library is pretty good. You might want to include another castle. Very tricky deck to build. I haven't tested it yet, so I wouldn't read too much into this list, but I did spend a long time thinking about how I would play Jafar, and this is it. I think this is going to be the best Amethyst Steel deck this set. Now that is a hot take because I know a lot of you are eagerly awaiting my mid-range Steel purple deck, but I don't think it's that good. And we're going to talk about why in a moment, but I think this might be the better of the two. I can't really rate it that highly right now though because it's got a lot to prove to me. I haven't tested it at all yet, so I can't put it high up in the tier list, but it's definitely a dark horse for me. Steel Jafar, I'm going to put into the C tier as another deck I haven't really tested, but I think could be decent. That's all I've got to say on Jafar. Keep your eye on it. Let's look at the Repeat deck next. All right, so Repeat or Repeat is focusing around using Pete Games referee multiple times. It's very similar to the mid-range Amethyst Steel deck I won a set champs with last season and almost won a Golden Mickey. It was like one lore away from a Golden Mickey. The Library, I think, is a great addition for this deck with the Brooms and the Chernobogs. And Pete is really, really interesting. It can sing Friends. You can bounce it back with the Fox, with the Snake, and Repeat. And that's why it's called Repeat. I think it's going to be a very good deck against Amber Steel songs. The Pete can also be pretty problematic for any deck playing a whole new world. And therefore, I think it's got some very good matchups. Having said that, outside of the Tink shift, it's going to struggle maybe to deal with hyper aggro. Although the Fox, the Rafiki, the Tinkerbell, and the Elsa are all my ways of kind of trying to give it enough coverage. I definitely think this deck is going to be relying on controlling the board and then using the power of the Library and the Queen's Castle. It's very possible you end up with 4 copies of each. I think you always play 4 libraries, maybe 3 Queen's Castle, maybe 2, probably 3. I've only gone for 2 here, but I think there's a world you play 4. Again, not a deck I've tested yet. I'm just not super convinced. I think this is a deck which is going to be very good at countering some of the best decks in the game, however. And I think this is maybe like right now for week 1 or 2 of the set. I don't think I would really go near this deck. But as the meta settles, if decks like Amber Steel Songs, Under the Sea begin to dominate, this could prove to be a very strong deck indeed. For me, I'm going to put Repeat into the C tier. I don't really believe in it that much. Maybe it could go into the B tier. I'll put it into the B tier. But I don't know, mate. It's got a lot to prove to me. I'm not convinced. But again, I do think, as I've said, this is more a deck which you build into the meta. And right now, the meta is so open. It's very difficult to build this deck in the right way. I'm not a huge believer in the deck overall. I personally feel like Jafar might have some more longevity. And another deck, which we're going to be looking at in just a moment, I think might kind of fit that more mid-range style of deck, this set. Let's look at that one next. Yeah, so this is Julian's take on the deck. I would be pretty interested in playing the library with the Chernobyls and the Brooms. I'm not sure if Clarabelle quite fits in there, but I can see it. I think the item removal is a nice addition. Sir Hiss to deal with some evasives like Diablo, I suppose. Kit can also deal with Diablo. Very, very interesting deck. I have a feeling that Emerald Amethyst could be very well positioned this set to be kind of the mid-range deck, which doesn't look that amazing on paper, but just has the tools necessary to beat everything you need it to be able to beat. Definitely a deck I'm going to be experimenting with, and I will have a guide out for in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to go ahead and put this deck into the A tier. I think it's going to be really good. Okay, so Blue Purple Blurple is a bit of a fan favorite. Lots of people are very excited for it. I'm not sure I believe in it that much, but I haven't tried it yet. The way I've built it is going to surprise a lot of people, but I'm focusing around Mama Odie. The reason for that, and there is a very good reason, is because I've been absolutely, completely and utterly destroyed by this card in this deck by Tim, one of the game designers at Ravensburger. In fact, if you watch the Disney Lorcana Challenge Bologna, you would have seen the show match where Tim completely crushed me with a list looking pretty similar to this. Mama Odie is whenever you play a song, you may put the top card of your deck into your Inkwell face down and exerted. So I've put, there's One Jump Ahead in there, there's Friends, there's Let It Go. Might also want to add in How Far I'll Go as another ramp tool. I could definitely see that. I also put It Calls Me in there as a random 1-cost song, which just draws a card, which could just be absolutely popping off with Mama Odie. I also put Chicha in the deck. Chicha hasn't really found a home yet. During your turn, when you put a card into your Inkwell, if it's the second card you put into your Inkwell this turn, you may draw a card. With things like One Jump, that could be good. And Mama Odie and Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse can sing Friends in this deck. I don't know. I thought it was a pretty interesting deck. I'm not sure I believe in it that much. When I experiment with the deck, I want to experiment with Genie and Olaf as cards. Genie is when this character is exerted, opposing characters can't ready at the start of their turn. And Olaf is for each exerted character opponents have in play, you pay 1 ink less. And it's just a 6/6 evasive. I think the deck's got potential. I do also think there's maybe a way of playing like a Bruno Madrigal type deck with the Merlin's Cottage, which reveals the top card of each player's deck because you can just name the card, draw it, and gain 3 lore. A lot of other people are just going to play a more traditional version of the deck without the Mama Odie though, and you absolutely can do that. I just thought this looked a bit more spicy and probably has a little bit more legs to actually be competitive, because I don't personally believe in the Sapphire Amethyst traditional stuff. I think you need a little bit more juice, and I think Mama Odie definitely can provide that. But maybe How Far I'll Go should be in the deck because you can sing it with Goat, Rabbit, and Madam Mim Elephant as well. I'm going to put Blue Purple into the C tier. Definitely one to keep an eye on. I think it could be okay. Speaking of one to keep an eye on, oh my goodness, please close your eyes when I show you this next deck list. It is the worst list I've ever shared on a video, ever. And it took me stupidly long to build. Okay guys, no one screenshot this. This will be our little secret, okay? Please nobody show anybody this deck list that I've just cooked up. I wanted to really find something in particular for this ink color combination. All the other ink color combinations, I had some ideas. But with Sapphire Amber, it was just the one deck. I just had no idea what to do. Now, I had a few ideas. It's like, okay, you can build an aggro deck. But then I was like, okay, it's just going to be worse than other aggro decks, in truth. Like, I looked at the Caterpillar. I looked at some Queen, Princess synergy. with Daisy Duck. It just looked like a significantly worse aggro deck than the other ones. I was also quite interested in like a Queen theme deck where you use all the Queen cards. It looked awful. I deleted the deck very, very quickly. This deck looks awful too. I also looked at Grand Pabby, which is a card I'm a big fan of. You gain lore whenever you heal a card. Amber has lots of really interesting items which can heal the whole board. There's a new Sapphire song which can heal the whole board. The problem is, how do you get your characters damaged in the first place? You just can't reliably. So then I arrived at this monstrosity. Now, I actually think that there's probably not enough items in this deck, but all the items are pretty terrible. But there's a good chance you just want to add in more items and remove the Gyro Gear Loose for some just one-cost random items, like the Scepter of Arendelle, for example, just so you've got lots of items. And it is an item aggro deck, maybe, somehow, sort of thing. So you got Daisy Duck. Daisy Duck's pretty good. Then on turn 2, you're looking for Scuttle, which if you've got enough items, I think we're currently at 20. You probably want to be closer to 26 with this kind of deck, to be honest. Your Scuttle's going to put an item into your hand. And then you can use the Queen on 3. You look at the top 4 cards of your deck. You may reveal an item card and put it in your hand. If the item costs 3 or less, put it in play for free instead. Now, you could also play the 4-cost Sapphire item, Eye of Fate, which gives you extra lore once per turn. To be honest, I probably should have put that in the deck, but I removed it because of the Queen. But it does still go into your hand. I just wanted to play the items for free off the Queen. But probably put the Eye of the Fates in and get rid of the Gyro Gear Loose. That's going to be updated in the description. The Gyro Gear Loose can also exert to play an item card from your discard, but puts it on top. Triton also exerts to banish one of your items to gain 3 lore, and that's where Sven comes in. When you play this character, you may ready chosen character. They can't quest or challenge for the rest of this turn. So with the Queen, you exert her on 4, you find an item, you play it for free, and then on 4 you play Sven, you ready the Queen, and you go again. Now that sounds pretty tasty. In the late game, you can do that with Triton. You banish one of your items, essentially questing for 3, and you just Sven, and again, you get 3 more lore. And there's some other cool synergies with this deck. With Glean, you can banish a chosen item, its player gains 2 lore. There's also Queen Sensicore at the start of your turn. If you have a Princess or Queen character in play, gain 1 lore. It is only Ariel and the Queen that we have, but I just thought it might be good enough. It's that's how bad the items are. We're playing that. Basil's Magnifying Glass, you look at the top 3 cards of your deck. You may reveal an item card, put it into your hand, but you have to pay 2 to do so. Maurice's Workshop, whenever you play another item card, you may pay 1 to draw a card. And Medal of Heroes is a really fascinating card with Ariel, Who's It Collector. You exert it, pay 2, and banish this item. Chosen character of yours gets +2 lore this turn. So if you pay 2 on Medal of Heroes, give your Ariel 2+ lore, she suddenly quests for free, and whenever you play an item, you may ready this character. With the Eye of the Fates as well, you can maybe get your Ariel questing for 5 or 6 a turn quite swiftly. That's the deck idea. I really wanted to give you guys something very different, which you could only play with Amber Sapphire. And hopefully I delivered. I'm sure you can see lots of time actually did go into this deck. I just think I actually misread the Queen. I didn't realize that the Queen was still going to put the Eye of the Fates into my hand. So I'm going to put Eye of the Fates in. Gyro Gear Loose can go. Pacha's kind of cool. At the start of your turn, if you have an item in play, gain 1 lore and it quests for 2. Guys, I'm not going to lie. The more I look at this deck, the more proud of myself I am. This is the biggest pile I ever made, but I kind of like the look of it. Is it going to be good? Absolutely not. Probably not, but maybe it could be okay. B tier, of course. How could I put it anywhere else? Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Lemon and Lime. Under the Sea, sing together. So this deck got very little new things. It got You're Welcome, and that is just about it. But adding is maybe front contender for best deck in the game. I think it's just very, very good. The biggest thing about this deck is that Bucky got banned. Bucky caused this deck a lot of problems. It's a very slow deck. It's got lots of control. It is inconsistent. But with the fact Bucky's banned, there's less Diablos. This is really the only deck I think Diablo still makes sense in. And therefore your Diablo is much more likely to stick around. You've got the incredible combo of Diablo on 1, see if your opponent has an answer to Diablo. And even if they do, you can often shift in Diablo and sing Bare Necessities to discard it if it's a Brawl or a Baboom. Of course, you've got the Hidden Cove to move into as well. Prince John, just absolutely tremendous in this one, comboing with Singing Bare Necessities or Sudden Chill on turn 2 with your Sir Hiss or your Ursula, or of course your Diablo. You Have Forgotten Me is just fantastic to really punish these slower decks. I think in particular, this deck is going to be really strong against the Blue Cow deck. It's going to be good against a lot of decks which go low to the floor. It's got the control to beat the kind of slower decks, but it's got hand control. But with Under the Sea, you can sing Under the Sea on turn 4 if you get Aerial down on turn 3, which means that you should have a decent chance of beating aggro. Even if you don't, Prince John on 3, the Muses on 4, and then you can sing a bunch of songs and bounce stuff back to your opponent's hand with the Muses might also give you enough coverage there as well. I do think it's a very strong deck. I do think maybe as the meta develops, it might fall off a little bit, because I would imagine there's some matchups it struggles with. I think locations can historically cause this deck a problem, but that's where your Welcome can come in. You can shuffle a location into that player's deck, and then you could just slam You Have Forgotten Me. If you sing your Welcome with the Muses, and then you play You Have Forgotten Me, discard both the cards they drew, you draw 2, that sounds absolutely bonkers. So I think this deck's going to be really good. I think it's going to be very popular, and it's my top pick for best deck in the game from the first week. But things can change very quickly, so make sure you're subscribed to see all the updates. So this is my meta report, but we are at that stage in the video where we might just want to shift a few things around again. I think first and foremost, I'm maybe going to move this up. I'm kind of tempted to move a few more things up into the S tier, because I do think it's like the meta might be a bit more like this. You know? Might be something more like this, maybe. I think that like it's really easy to look at this tier list of just a few decks in the S tier and think that they're just like the be-all and end-all. I don't think that's the case. I just have a feeling that these decks do have a slight edge over the other options available. So yeah, really excited to see where this all ends up in a few weeks' time. I definitely think the decks in the C tier have the most potential to go up higher. And there's definitely a lot of decks I haven't yet played myself. So definitely take all of this with a pinch of salt. Tempo's sneaked up into the S tier. I think I'm going to keep it like this now, though, for now. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if you agree or disagree with anything. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. I appreciate you. If you want to support the channel, become a YouTube member or a Patreon. I appreciate you. Until next time, bye now.